Welcome back to The Note. Argentina's new President Macri has done the hard part. He's settled his long-standing lawsuit with US creditors, and Argentina has returned to the international capital markets. Now comes the even harder part, dealing with a serious recession at home in Argentina and persuading international investors to keep investing in a new Argentina. Now, this week, the Financial Times hosted President Macri at an event here at the New York Stock Exchange, where he was able to talk about the new Argentina to Wall Street investors. Argentina's launch of a new bond earlier this year was a huge success and deeply emotional for the financiers involved.
I thought it was emotional for all the bankers that participated in the trade. It was a benchmark trade. We were wondering if we actually could raise $15 billion in multiple tranches. So to our surprise, they raised over $70 billion in demand. They were able to reduce the cost from 8% to actually 7.5% in the 10-year, which is now trading at 6%. And actually, they were able also to raise the amount from 15 billion to 16.5. So overall, it was an incredible trade, largest oversubscribed trade in emerging market history.
Many of these companies in Argentina are now accessing to the market, and this is allowing us to reignite investment, which has been pretty much non-existent over the last 5 years or so.
There are still problems. The economy is in a mess. It's difficult to measure inflation at present, but experts' projections are quite scary.
If inflation is in September, this month, stays around what some private consultants are saying, around 1%, 1.2%, that would mean that the third quarter of this year will end up with an annual inflation rate that is already our target for next year, 17%. So 9 months into the show, we've already aligned not just expectations, but the actual inflation numbers into the target.
Meanwhile, economic activity has dipped as President Macri cuts subsidies. And of course, there's the currency. Long prone to devaluations in the past, it's weakened drastically compared to neighbouring Brazil. Now, however you measure it, Argentina's capital markets are remarkably shallow after more than a decade in the international wilderness. Whether you look at the amount of banking finance it has, or local capital markets, international capital markets, or its equities, they are remarkably thin in volume compared to the other big countries in Latin America. Argentina remains one of the biggest economies in Latin America. Only Brazil and Mexico are bigger. And it's also still one of the very wealthiest, even after its decade in the cold. Only the finance and trade center Panama and copper-rich Chile enjoy higher standards of living. And yet, Argentina has the markets and financial system of a far smaller and poorer country. Its banking system is underdeveloped, even compared to Peru or Venezuela. The last administration abandoned its reform pension system, so it no longer has a pool of capital like Chile or other big Latin American countries. Daily volume on Argentina's stock exchange is tiny compared to Brazil, which has problems of its own, and that makes it far harder to get people to buy stocks, because they may not be able to sell.
The Argentine capital markets, the domestic capital markets, are quite shallow, representing only about 13% of GDP. And it's clearly not sufficient to be able to fund the opportunities that there are in the country. So the international markets are clearly open for both the government, as we've seen with their very successful bond issue, and the provinces have followed with their own $4.7 billion of issuance. And now we're seeing the corporates. So they are able to access capital in the form of US dollar lending, but we're really working together with the government to try to help broaden the domestic capital markets, to help the pension funds that are there to look at different kinds of financing vehicles.
There's a chance of a virtuous circle. Argentina still has to pay a lot for borrowing. As the economy comes under control, that will help keep the Argentine people on board and reassure foreign investors that Argentina is safe to invest in. But of course, it could also be a vicious circle.
Argentina needs to improve rating in order to have access to other markets, for example, the sterling market, which is a much more high grade than the euro and the US. But also, I think they need to meet all the objectives that they have been selling to investors. Building credibility and trust is the way they're going to get there to lower the financial cost.
President Macri's charm offensive is going to carry on long after this reception at the NYSE. But I think both the opportunity and the challenge are clear. The opportunity is that Argentina has a market and a financial system that are far too small, far too undeveloped for an economy of its scale and sophistication. There is a huge opportunity there. The challenge is that Argentina has often gone the way of populism in the past. It needs to persuade international investors that it's not going to do that again, and that means that Argentina's new rulers have to persuade their people that it's not worth going back down the path of populism.